In 1991, Sergei Krikalev was sent on a space mission. It was supposed to last just 5 months. However, that cosmonaut was stuck in space for 311 days. Due to the Soviet Union and money issues, Krikalev wasn't able to come back when he was scheduled to. When Germany purchased a $24 million ticket to send Klaus Dietrich a replacement, Krikalev was finally able to return. What could have possibly happened to trap someone in space? How was he able to return? Here is Krikalev's story, his struggles, and his accomplishments. The cosmonaut who was left stranded in space. On May 9, 1991, Sergei Krikalev launched on the Soviet space station Mir for a 5-month mission. In January 1992, Krikalev was into his 8th month of the mission and had no idea when he was coming home. Krikalev was a flight engineer. He arrived at the Mir station with a British astronaut Helen Sharman and Anatoly Artsebarsky, who spent 5 months aboard Mir. Sharman was conducting experiments and spent 8 days on Mir. Krikalev and Artsebarsky were ultimately left alone on the space station after Sharman returned to Earth. The two of them used their time well. They conducted numerous scientific experiments and touched up the space station. On October 2, 1992, a relief crew bound for the Mir station took off as planned to take over for Artsebarsky. Krikalev already agreed to extend his tour because Dr. Audakirov, the scheduled replacement, didn't go through the training for long stays in space. Artsebarsky, Abukirov, and Franz Wiebach, the first Austrian in space, all returned to Earth on October 10th. Krikalev and Commander Alexander Volkov, who came on the 2nd October flight, stayed on board. The two of them were alone in the space station. However, events at the USSR down on Earth put the date of their return in question. We'll get to that later. First, let's talk about the Mir station. In 1976, the Mir project was initiated by a Soviet decree. It took a decade before it made it to orbit. Mir was named after the Russian word for peace. The USSR intended to use the spacecraft for long-term research projects. In 1986, the Soviets launched the first of its modules. They did so for the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, which at the time was part of the Soviet Union. After the first module went into orbit, 6 more were added to complete the space station's structure during the next decade. Mir orbited at a speed of over 17,000 miles per hour during its run. The altitude was between 220 and 232 miles away from Earth. There, Mir could accommodate up to 6 people. However, usually just 3 cosmonauts lived there at once because it was so cramped. The station experienced 16 sunrises and sunsets every single day. Therefore, they had to back out portholes to stimulate night so that they could fall asleep. The cosmonauts usually woke up at about 8 a.m. on the Moscow time zone. In the morning, they ate breakfast and got ready, which can take a few hours. Then they work until 1 p.m. before coming home for lunch and a workout. After eating lunch, the cosmonauts spend another 3 hours working and 1 more hour of exercise. After that, they finally eat dinner and have some free time. Krikalev told Discover magazine about his favorite pastimes in space. He said, "Every spare moment we try to look at the Earth." This is pretty interesting because most people can't relate. In 1997, an American named Jerry Lininger spent time on Mir. He explained his experience of looking down on Earth. "Today, I saw huge dust storms in the Sahara of Africa." He continued and said, "Lake Chad drying up. 5 minutes later, the Nile, the triangle of the Sinai Peninsula, and the Red Sea all in one view. Then Elbrus and the snow-covered Caucasus." Okay, so back to Krikalev and Volkov, the men who were on Mir station in October 1991. They both spent time on the space station for 151 days, in between 1988 and 1989, so for both men it's their second time on Mir. In 1958, Krikalev was born in the Soviet city of Leningrad, which is now known as St. Petersburg. After high school, he attended the Leningrad Mechanical Institute. In 1981, he graduated with an honors degree in mechanical engineering. Soon after, Krikalev started working at a Russian company called NPO Energia. The company provided and designed services for the Soviet Union's space program. Krikalev was not only working in mission control, but he also developed space travel protocols and equipment. In addition, Krikalev was part of the team trying to salvage Salyut 7 space station in 1985 after the systems failed. In 1985, Krikalev earned a place in the Soviet cosmonaut program. After he fully completed basic training 1 year later, he was chosen to be a part of the Buran spacecraft initiative. However, he was diverted to special training in 1988 for a mission aboard Mir. For the mission, he had to learn to undertake spacewalks. Alexander Volkov was born in Ukraine in 1948 when it was still a part of the Soviet Socialist Republics. Despite being born and raised in Ukraine, Volkov came from a Russian background. Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space when Volkov was just 13. Apparently, this was Volkov's inspiration to become a cosmonaut. Volkov attended Ukraine's Chuguyov Higher Air Force School, where he trained as a pilot. After graduating in 1970, he worked as a test pilot for a few years. He finally joined the Cosmonaut program in 1976. In 1985, he got his first spaceflight aboard the Soyuz T-14 ship to the Soviet Salyut 7 space station. They were both aboard a spacecraft called Soyuz TM-7 when it was launched from Baikonur bound for the Mir station. Krikalev was on board as the engineer and Volkov was the commander. Jean-Luc Chrétien was also aboard. In 1982, he was the first Frenchman in space. The three Soviet cosmonauts with on board 3 more newcomers for 25 days. This was the longest amount of time that 6 people lived in the cramped station. After 25 days, 2 of the original cosmonauts and Chrétien returned to Earth. However, Krikalev, Volkov, and Valery Polyakov stayed aboard. At least they had more room now. In April of 1989, the 3 of them returned to Earth. Polyakov had been on board for 240 days, and Krikalev and Volkov spent 151 days in orbit on their first time aboard Mir. Polyakov went aboard Mir for the second time in 1994 and spent 437 days in space. It was the longest amount of time a person has been away from Earth at the time. After one mission on Mir, Krikalev decided to re-enter training for a Mir project in 1990. For this mission, Krikalev was part of the backup crew. This meant that Krikalev could fly if someone from the original crew backs out. Since nobody dropped out, Krikalev stayed on Earth during this mission. However, by December that year, Krikalev was already in training for another Mir mission. For this one, he was the first-choice crew member and not a backup. His preparation included making up to 10 spacewalks. Krikalev returned to Mir aboard Soyuz TM-12 with Soviet cosmonaut Anatoly Artsebarsky and scientist Helen Sherman. In 1963, Sherman was born in Sheffield. She and 13,000 other people answered a radio ad asking for people who wanted to be UK's first astronaut. She was chosen and spent over a year of training intensely. She finally went aboard Mir, and her stay in space was scheduled to be short. She got to go to space, but she returned to Earth just 7 days later. Engineer Musa Manarov and crew commander Viktor Afanasyev were already aboard Mir when Krikalev, Artsebarsky, and Sherman joined. On May 26, 1991, they all returned to Earth except for Krikalev and Artsebarsky. During this time, Artsebarsky did 6 spacewalks and spent more than 33 hours outside the spacecraft. There was a crew scheduled to come replace Krikalev and Artsebarsky in October. However, the engineer who was supposed to take over for Krikalev didn't have enough training for a long stay in space. Due to the situation that July, Krikalev agreed to extend his stay on Mir. The relief crew still took off mid-October 1991, but not to replace Krikalev. The 3 newcomers from the relief crew were Commander Alexander Volkov, Austrian scientist Franz Wiebok, and from Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, Dr. Abukirov. Supposedly, the Austrian government paid Soviets $7 million to get Wiebok aboard Mir. On October 10th, Wiebok, Abukirov, and Artsebarsky returned to Earth. Volkov and Krikalev were the only ones left on Mir. However, events at the USSR complicated their stay. That August, just 1 month after Krikalev had agreed to extend its mission, Russia kicked things off. However, on August 19th, radical communists launched a military coup in Moscow because they were unhappy with the way things were going in the Soviet Union. Many changes washed over the Soviet Union building up to the coup attempt. Since 1988, Mikhail Gorbachev was the state leader. He oversaw reforms to the Soviet economy. In addition, he was lessening the strict censorship that the USSR had for years. This resulted in affecting the space program. Many territories, including East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, overthrew their Soviet-supported communist government in 1989. However, in 1991, the Russian Communist Party decided on one more attempt to roll back the Gorbachev reforms. Tanks were pushed into Red Square in Moscow. This attempt ended in failure just 2 days later. However, it managed to destabilize what was left of the Soviet Union. By December that year, the Soviet Union was destroyed. Unfortunately, it led to putting the Soviet space program and Mir space station in question. This was because the spacecraft bound of Mir was launched from the Baikonur, Kazakhstan base, one of the republics fighting for independence. The Soviet authorities agreed to send a Kazakh national to Mir in an attempt to keep Kazakhstan on board. Takhtarov-Bukirov was chosen and arrived on October 2nd, 1991. His stay aboard the space station was short. He went in place of an experienced astronaut that should have been the one to replace Krikalev. Sergei Krikalev had been highly impacted by these events as 1991 continued, and things only got worse. On top of already having extended his original mission, there was no scheduled endpoint to his time on Mir. Krikalev admitted to Discover in 2016 that his prolonged stay in space was concerning. He was actually very stressed about how long he'd be there for. Krikalev didn't really understand what was happening. He kept being told that there wasn't enough money to bring him back to Earth. Mission Control kept telling him to wait a bit longer. After another month passed, he kept getting the same answers. He said, "They say it's tough for me, not really good for my health. But now the country is in such difficulty, the chance to save money must be the top priority." Krikalev expressed, "For us it was totally unexpected. We didn't understand what happened. When we discussed this, we tried to grasp how it would affect the space program." As expected, he was also worried about his own health and well-being. Do I have enough strength? Will I be able to readjust for this longer stay to complete the program? Naturally, at one point I had my doubts. The Washington Post ran a story in 1992 titled, "Left in Space, the Cosmonaut's Endless Orbit." At that point, Krikalev was orbiting the Earth for about 9 months. The article stated that Krikalev got to speak to his wife Elena each week. What they didn't mention, however, was that she was actually working at Mission Control. Elena described her thoughts to Discover magazine. She explained, "I tried never to talk about unpleasant things because it must have been hard for him. As far as I can make out, Sergei was doing the same thing. I can only imagine how tough it was for Elena back at home. The couple even had a new baby." In addition to the stress of being trapped in space, Krikalev wasn't making that much money being a cosmonaut. He earned just 500 rubles a month, which was equivalent to $2.50. If you think the situation couldn't get worse, Russia's economic situation was also negatively affecting Krikalev's comforts aboard the Mir. He loved honey, but sadly there was a shortage in Russia. Instead, he received onions and horseradish as a substitute, the worst possible replacements for honey. Ultimately, a replacement team was on its way. Krikalev and Volkov would finally be able to go back to Earth. On March 25, 1992, both men arrived at their home planet safely, landing in Kazakhstan. However, by that time, Krikalev had circled the Earth at least 5,000 times. He stayed in space for 311 days, which was a world record at the time. Unfortunately, he came back to his country ruined. For Krikalev to return to Earth, Germany paid $24 million to buy a ticket for Klaus-Dietrich Flade, his replacement. However, he finally made it back. It was reported that Krikalev's appearance was pale as flour and sweaty like a lump of wet dough when he returned. Not bad for someone stuck in space for over 300 days. Incredibly, the fearless Krikalev didn't seem to be too affected by his uncertain stay aboard the Mir. In October 1992, NASA promised to launch a space shuttle with a Russian on board. The Russian Space Agency chose Krikalev as one of the cosmonauts to train for this revolutionary partnership between Russia and America. In 1994, the shuttle launched and Krikalev was on board. An American named Robert Cabana and Krikalev were the first 2 astronauts aboard the International Space Station in 1998. He returned to the space station 2 more times and even did a 6-month stay in 2005. Krikalev spent a total of 803 days in space and was on 6 different missions by the time he retired as a cosmonaut. However, he continued to work as a director of manned spaceflight at Russia's Roscosmos Space Corporation. Although Krikalev spent 311 days in space and unintentionally broke the record, he got beat a few years later. Valery Polyakov beat him, staying in space for 438 consecutive days. In 2018, Gennady Padalka also broke Krikalev's record. Cosmonaut Gennady Padalka spent a total of 879 days in space, while Krikalev was there for 803. Still impressive if you ask me. The world record for the most space missions for one person is 7. This record is held by 2 astronauts, Jerry L. Ross and Franklin Chang Diaz. John Young is another astronaut breaking a world record. Young holds the record for being in command or piloting 4 different space shuttles. The youngest person to ever fly in a rocket ship was German Titov, who was just 25 years old at the time. The oldest person to fly was John Glenn, and he was 77 when he broke that record. The crew for the Apollo 13 moon mission was the farthest astronauts have ever been from the Earth. It was 401,056 kilometers, which is about 249,205 miles away. Good thing they didn't get lost out there.